Hello, my name is Andrew Cedeno, and today I'll be presenting on magical realism in Latin American literacy. The genre of magical realism deconstructs Latin American stereotypes with drug cartels, myths, and dramatization, and brought magic back into Latin American culture, art, and history. What is magical realism? Magical realism is a literary genre in which realistic fiction is merged with surreal elements in a blend where there is no real distinction between the two. In Latin America, it served as a framework for imaginative stories that critique political power and the fringes of society. This allowed Latin American authors to represent the real world in an alternative way. What makes it magical? Magic realism seamlessly merges magic into the real world without making you think that it is out of place. The magic used in the stories is often strange to the reader. However, it is accepted inside the story. How is it realistic? Magical realism stories take place in a realistic setting that takes place inside the real world rather than within a fantasy land or science fiction. In magical realism, the stories are realistic by nature. However, they must be believable. The characters in these stories deal with everyday to complex issues that relate to real life. When it started, magical realism derived from the 1920s to a school of painters in Germany by the early avant-garde artists. It came from a European art movement that reacted against traditional art with modern art making. This period was known as the Return to Order, which occurred after the First World War. The term was first used by literary critic Angel Flores, who analyzed both English and Spanish literature during the magical realism movement in Latin America. He expressed it as an amalgamation of realism and fantasy. The magical realist movement. Magical realism described the works of the philosopher and writer Jorge Luis Borges from Argentina, who influenced the magical realist movement in Latin American literature. Published in newspapers, his earliest collection of short stories called A Universal History of Infamy helped set into motion the magical realism movement. There are many different writers in various Latin American countries who contributed to the magical realism movement using their own styles and ideas. And Angel Flores had recognized that this genre as a natural fit for the Americas. As indigenous communities, there often did not draw as fixed a line between the natural and supernatural as did their European counterparts, allowing the popularity of magical realism to grow throughout all of Latin America. Here we have major writers in Latin America, and notable magical realism writers in Latin America include Garcia Marquez, a Colombian novelist. There's a line from the 100 Years of Solitude that symbolizes that it has the essence of magical realism. And it goes, one night in the room where Ursula had slept, they saw a yellow glow coming through the crumbling cement, as if an underground sun had changed the floor of the room into a pane of glass. They did not have to turn on the light. It was sufficient to lift the broken slabs in the corner where Ursula's bed had always stood, and where the glow was most intense to find the secret crypt that Aureliano Segundo had worn himself out searching for during the delirium of his excavations. And this was from 100 Years of Solitude, pages 370 to 371. His writing showed how real life is filled with magic. Garcia Marquez helped introduce and popularize magical realism to the world with his book, 100 Years of Solitude. He is quoted in another book called Metamorphosis, Creative Imagination and Fine Arts Between Life Projects and Human Aesthetic Aspirations. Now, in this book, Garcia Marquez says, magical realism expands the categories of the world, expands the categories of the real so as to encompass myth, magic, and other extraordinary phenomena in nature or experience which European realism excluded. We have another magical realist writer by the name of Alejo Carpentier Ivalmont, a Cuban novelist. His novel, Los Pasos Perdidos, or it's also called in English, The Lost Steps, was his best known work. It's about a first-person account of a character who travels to the Orinoco jungle in search of the meaning of life and the origins of time. We have Laura Esquivel, a Mexican novelist, and also another magical realist writer. In her novel, Like Water for Chocolate, she showed how the mother's emotional suppression of her daughter reflected the daily silencing of those who deeply suffer in Latin America. However, in this novel, whenever ordinary events in real life encounters repression or a heightened sense of emotions, a supernatural event follows, such as soups that can heal any mental or physical illness. There is Isabel Allende, a Chilean novelist who used magical realism to bring to the public both political and feminist matters. Now, here we have a video describing the influence of many writers on the magical realist movement.
Latin American boom primer. When it comes to Latin American writers who have gained notoriety among non-Spanish speakers, one name stands out above all others: Gabriel Garcia Marquez. Marquez's works, which include 100 Years of Solitude and Love in the Time of Cholera, are dense, highly energetic epics that deal with the history and lore of his native Colombia. He is often cited as being the author responsible for bringing a particularly Latin version of magical realism to an international audience. What many readers outside of Latin America may be unaware of, however, is that Marquez was a figure in a second movement. Throughout the 1960s and 1970s, writers from several Latin American countries found success in the United States and in Europe. The movement came to be known as the Latin American boom. Now please, sit back and enjoy today's edition of Lit Tips. Novelists and poets of the boom era never formally started the movement together, and in fact came from countries that were thousands of miles apart. What united them was a desire to challenge the norms of literature at the time and bring to it a sense of urgency they felt was missing. Among their key influences were the complex intellectual short stories of Jorge Luis Borges and the radical experiments in form of European modernists like James Joyce. While there are countless writers deserving of attention who came out of this movement, today's video will focus on three of the most well-known, excluding Marquez. They are Mexico's Carlos Fuentes, Mario Vargas Llosa of Peru, and the Argentinian Julio Cortázar. Each profile will also include a recommendation of where to start with each of these authors. Carlos Fuentes is arguably Mexico's most acclaimed novelist. His work is characterized by strong critiques of the social and political inequality found in Mexican society and in the rest of Latin America at large. His characters often start off as idealists who over time are either destroyed by the system or themselves become a part of it. A prime example of this is The Death of Artemio Cruz. Published in 1963, the novel follows the titular character as he lies on his deathbed, reflecting on his life from his childhood to his days fighting in the Mexican Revolution, to his rise to become one of the country's most powerful business tycoons and a member of the controversial, all-controlling Institutional Revolutionary Party. Using multiple narrators, flashbacks, and spanning decades, the novel is comparable to a Mexican version of Orson Welles' Citizen Kane. Through this non-traditional biography, Cruz comes to symbolize the Mexico of the 20th century and beyond as a country seemingly unable to escape the demons of its past, no matter how many reforms and reinventions it attempts to undertake. Mario Vargas Llosa is to date Peru's only Nobel laureate in literature. Like Fuentes, his work is often critical of both the past and present practices of his country. 1969's Conversation in the Cathedral is set in the 1950s and follows multiple characters living under the military dictatorship of Manuel A. Odria. The framing device involves a young journalist and his wealthy father's former chauffeur having a chance run-in after years of not seeing one another. They go to a bar, the cathedral of the title, and lose hours catching up on old times. Their reminiscences, which get increasingly muddled as the drinks keep flowing, make up the bulk of the novel and give Vargas Llosa the opportunity to examine the massive class divides found in Peru. Through this examination of history that at the time of the book's publication was still fresh in readers' minds, Vargas Llosa seeks an answer to a question he poses on the first page of the novel. At what precise moment had Peru fucked itself up? Julio Cortázar was highly influential on not just the literary scene of the 1960s and 1970s, but on the cinematic scene as well. In 1966, the title story of his collection, Blow Up and Other Stories, served as the inspiration for Michelangelo Antonioni's Blow Up, one of the most influential films of the decade. Cortázar's most famous work is the novel Hopscotch, published in 1963. Following a group of Argentinian expatriates drifting through their bohemian lives in Paris, the story is presented in a fragmented, non-linear manner. Readers have two options for how to approach the book. The first is to read the first 56 chapters the conventional way, and in these chapters is where the core plot of the novel is found. The second option is to start on the 73rd chapter, and from there to jump around, turning back and forth seemingly at random. Each chapter ends with a marker for which chapter to go to next. So for example, the one at the end of chapter 73 indicates to flip all the way back to the beginning and start there, and so on. The novel contains 99 expendable chapters, taking the form of narrative asides, short stories, and quotations from newspapers and other novels. It's an audacious, sometimes confusing approach, but one that puts the novel in a category all its own. We hope that you've enjoyed this brief introduction to the writers of the Latin American boom. Of course, there are dozens more writers from this era which we didn't have time to cover, and even more great Latin American writers who have emerged in the decades since the boom ended. These authors we hope to explore in future videos of Lit Tips. Until then, consider subscribing to our page for more videos, leave a comment in the comment section below, and suggest any writers who you'd like to see us examine in future episodes. Until next time, keep reading.
Now moving forward, Latin American and magical realism. The genre of magical realism is seen in literature, art, stories, and culture. It allows the imagination to be shown the enigmas of reality, to deconstruct the ideas, barriers, and unification of Latin America. The stories written in magical realism are a metaphor to experiences held by the Latin American writers in their time. These writers interweaved fantasy, myth, and folklore into the descriptive details of events in Latin America. Magical realism in Latin America. 100 Years of Solitude took a stance on the racial, socio-political hierarchy of the Caribbean with careful analysis. For example, women of African ancestry were feral and promiscuous in character, and worked for brothels, whereas white women regulated the political hierarchy. Now, I have questions for you. Why do you think authors would want to write about their experiences through fictional stories rather than stating just the facts? What benefits does magical realism provide in understanding Latin American history and culture? Do you think magical realism is a legitimate literacy genre? Can Latin American countries benefit from the magical realist genre in their writings today? And here is my works cited. And that concludes my presentation. Thank you for allowing me to share this presentation with you, and I hope you have a great day.